So good to see all of you here with us today. My name's Eric. I'm one of the pastors here if you're new to City of God. We're going to be in Hebrews chapter 12 this morning. So if you have a Bible and want to turn there, Hebrews chapter 12. We're on the final 2 weeks of our study through this book, so I hope you've enjoyed it. While you're turning there, a couple things we want you to know about. This is a busy time at City of God, one of our busiest times of the year. Next Sunday, right after second service, we have got a quick members meeting. It won't take long. We're going to do a quick Rooted update. We're going to talk a little about the pastor search we've got coming up, so some things we're excited about. If you can't make it, we'll record it and we'll be able to get you the link to that. But again, just a quick members meeting after the service next Sunday. Secondly, 2 weeks from today, we will not be here for Sunday morning worship. April 28th, we'll be at the Tippecanoe County Amphitheater for our Celebration Sunday service. If you haven't been around, we meet at 10:45 at the amphitheater. Both services get the opportunity to worship together, which is always fun, and we use it as a chance to just celebrate what God has done over the past year. One of the ways we do that is through baptisms. We've got 15 to 20 people who are going to get baptized so far. And so if you're interested in getting baptized or finding out more, go to the website, go to the Church Center app. You can register there. You're not signing up for anything yet, but somebody will reach out to you and give you some more information about that. And again, if you haven't been with us on that Sunday after the service, we'll have some food trucks there, and people bring lunches and picnic baskets and yard games and just spend the afternoon enjoying one another. Hopefully we get some weather like we have this morning. That would be fantastic. But that's 2 weeks from today, April 28th. We'd love to have you join us. Last announcement, this Friday, our 1025 ministry, our young professionals group, is hosting Secret Church at the City of God offices. This will start at 7. It's a joint Bible study through the book of Ruth, but they're also going to be praying for and thinking about the persecuted church throughout the world. Again, they need to know who's coming so they can get those materials together. You can register, again, on our website or on the Church Center app. So make sure you're checking those. Lots going on right now. But we're going to jump into Hebrews 12 this morning, verses 1 through 17. And as we do that, in their book, Great by Choice, Jim Collins and Morton T. Hansen write about Roald Amundsen, who was one of the first people to lead a successful expedition to the South Pole. And they talk about all that he did to prepare his body and to prepare himself for this difficult task ahead. When he knew this was coming in his late 20s, Roald Amundsen traveled from Norway to Spain for a 2-month sailing trip to earn a master's degree to start preparing for it. They write this was 1899. It was a 2,000-mile journey, and he decided to make the journey by bike to prepare himself for the long journey that was ahead in his future. He then experimented with, and not everybody will like this, but he experimented with eating raw dolphin meat to determine its usefulness as an energy supply. After all, he thought he may someday be shipwrecked, finding himself surrounded by dolphins, and he needed to know if he would be able to eat one. It was all part of his years of building a foundation for his quest, training his body, learning as much as possible from practical experience about what actually worked. He even made a pilgrimage, they write, to apprentice with Inuits. What better way to learn what worked in polar conditions than to spend time with those who had spent hundreds of years accumulating experience in ice and cold and snow and wind? He learned how they would use dogs to pull sleds. He observed how they never hurried, moving slowly and steadily, avoiding excessive sweat that could turn into ice and sub-zero temperatures. He adopted their clothing, loose-fitting, to help the sweat evaporate. He systematically practiced their methods and trained himself for every conceivable situation he might encounter on the way to the pole. His philosophy was this: you don't wait until you're in an unexpected storm to discover that you need more strength and endurance. You don't wait until you're shipwrecked to determine what you can and cannot eat. You don't wait until you're on an Antarctic journey to get good at skiing or becoming a dog handler. You prepare with intensity, he said, all the time so that when conditions turn against you, you can draw from a deep reservoir of strength. And equally, you prepare so that when conditions turn in your favor, you can strike hard. Admittedly, most of us haven't faced a task as daunting as leading an expedition to the South Pole. But my guess is over the course of your life, you faced a handful of instances where you were facing something that felt overwhelming, that took you outside of your comfort zone. A lot of you, or some of you, are about to graduate in May and head into the workforce for the first time. And you're asking the question, am I ready for this? Or maybe it's a job change, or maybe it was a change in family season when you got married, or you had your first child, or you sent a kid off to college for the first time. All of these major changes bring experiences that are unfamiliar to us. Maybe it was a medical or a financial challenge that was thrust upon you that you weren't prepared for. Whatever it is, we're all going to face at some point situations that we're not sure we'll be able to handle on our own, that make us uncomfortable. And I think there's a lot we can learn from Amundsen in this regard. What do we do when we know that a challenge is coming, when we can see it in the distance? Well, the first thing he did was he learned everything he could about the challenge ahead of him. He absorbed as much information as possible. But secondly, he did everything he could to prepare himself ahead of time. He wanted to prepare himself physically and mentally for the challenge that was ahead. Now, these at one level are just helpful ideas as we think about the challenges that we're going to face in the future, the changes that we're going to face. How can we best prepare for what life's going to bring? But as we turn to Hebrews 12, the reality is these are also helpful ideas for thinking through how we will remain faithful to Jesus throughout the course of our lives. As we think about this, it might not always be evident, but when we think about our relationship with Jesus, living for Christ or living the Christian life is a difficult task. It's a daunting challenge. The Bible regularly tells us that following Jesus is not easy, and one of the Bible's favorite ways of conceptualizing the Christian life is that of a long journey. It's a marathon. And as we think about the Christian life in these terms, one of the things we have to recognize is this: the Christian life is not something that's lived in the moment, it's lived over time, over a long period of time. And as the author of Hebrews wrote this book to a specific church, he's writing to a church that's struggling with staying faithful to Jesus over the long haul because they were being tempted to turn away from him. And there were various pressures they were experiencing, causing them to wonder that maybe they should abandon their faith in Christ. And so he writes this letter to encourage them, stay faithful to Jesus. Don't give up. Finish your race. We might not be facing the same pressures as the church that Hebrews was written to, but my guess is maybe some of you are here this morning and you're feeling a little pressure in your relationship with Jesus. Or you have in the past, or you will in the future if you haven't or aren't right now. That you'll be in a season where you're wondering, can I keep believing in Jesus in light of all the doubts that I have and questions that I can't seem to find an answer to, or the pressure that I feel from the world around me? Or maybe you're just tired of fighting against sin in your life and you're thinking it would be nice to just have a season of my life when I could do what I wanted to do and not have to worry about what God thinks or my church thinks or my Christian friends think, and I could just live however I wanted. Or maybe the struggle is you're just in a spot where you recognize my life would just be easier if I wasn't a Christian. I wouldn't have to get up early on a Sunday morning. My relationships would be a little easier. My family life, my life at work would just be a little more comfortable if I wasn't so focused on putting Jesus at the center of my life. And what's encouraging for us as we open Hebrews 12 is that if you're struggling in your relationship with God, you're not alone, and God knew you and I were going to struggle in our relationship with him. He knew it was going to be difficult for us to believe in him, but especially for us to believe in him and remain faithful to him throughout our lives. And so in Hebrews 12, God gives us a gift. He gives us instructions or plans for, here's how you can prepare for the long and difficult journey ahead. Here's how you can begin to think about the Christian life so that when it gets hard, you're not surprised and you're not tempted to abandon your faith in Jesus. So how do we prepare for this long journey of the Christian life? Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. Therefore, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, Let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. The first thing God offers us to help us remain faithful to him over the long haul is this, is he's trying to give us an accurate picture of the Christian life. Because one of the most tempting things we're going to face that might cause us to walk away from Jesus is when our expectations of what the Christian life is supposed to be doesn't match what God has actually said the Christian life would look like and is supposed to be. Because sometimes we have this misconception that once we put our hope and trust in Jesus, once we believe the gospel, life's just supposed to get better and better and easier and more comfortable and more convenient. And then what inevitably happens? Someone believes the gospel, they put their trust in Jesus, and life gets hard. A tragedy comes. Circumstances get really difficult. And it causes them to wrestle with, I really thought if the God of the universe was on my side, these kinds of things wouldn't happen anymore, that I wouldn't have to deal with these struggles and these frustrations and these tragedies in my life. Now, to be clear, when we put our hope and trust in Jesus, there are incredible things we receive, and we find joy and love and peace and hope and all of these things that Christ has offered to us. But how do we respond when we've believed in Jesus, when we've been adopted into the family of God, when God has told us that he's for us and life gets really difficult? First, we have to remember we are following Jesus in a fallen world. We need to understand the circumstances around us. God hasn't made all things new yet. Satan and sin and demons are still at work in the world, trying to destroy God's good creation, which includes us. So that's part of the reason we endure suffering in this life. But second, again, we need to recognize or have a clear picture of what the Christian life was meant to be. So we're not tempted to turn away when the Christian life doesn't meet our expectations. And how do we get a clear conception of what the Christian life was meant to be? We do this in part, we read in Hebrews 12, by looking at the cloud of witnesses around us, by looking at the lives of faithful men and women of God who have gone before us and what they've experienced, and mature Christians around us in our own day. As we study the lives of Christians, again, who have gone before us and who are around us, we quickly discover there is not a one-size-fits-all image of what the Christian life is going to look like. Our experiences may vary widely. Last week, Pastor Tim walked us through Hebrews 11, this chapter where the author of Hebrews summarizes the heroes of the faith, Old Testament saints, and what their lives looked like. And part of the reason he did that in Hebrews 11 was to show us, when you put your faith in God, what you experience in this life may be incredibly different from what someone else experiences. Back up to Hebrews 11, verse 32. And what shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith they conquered kingdoms, they enforced justice, they obtained promises, they stopped the mouths of lions, they quenched the power of fire, they escaped the edge of the sword, they were made strong out of weakness. They became mighty in war. They put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. And so he begins with, when you look at the lives of people who have followed God, one, you see some incredible things in their life. You see miracles that God has worked, how God showed up in a powerful way and moved in their life. And we should expect God to do that in our lives if we're following him. But it goes on in verse 35. He says, women received back their dead by resurrection, but some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in the skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and in caves of the earth. Do you see the wide range of experiences someone might have in this life, and all of them living faithful lives obedient to God? There were some in these stories who experienced incredible spiritual highs in their relationship with God. Not that life stayed there, but that was a part of their experience. And there were some who made the decision to worship God, and their lives got almost unbearably more difficult. But by showing us this example, the author of Hebrews is reminding us when we encounter difficult things, we're no different from the people of God who have gone before us. And in this fallen world, God has not promised us a smooth and easy life. We shouldn't be caught off guard when difficulties come. So some of what we can do to help prepare as we want to remain faithful to Jesus over the long haul is just be mindful of this fact. When life gets hard, it doesn't mean God has abandoned me necessarily. It doesn't mean that God is punishing me. It doesn't mean that God is not there. That we have all of these examples that show us, no, in the midst of difficult circumstances, God is there and He's for us and He's good, but our life with Him was never meant to produce a life free from suffering or trials or difficulties. Again, this helps prepare us to have a proper understanding of the Christian life so we can endure for the long haul. But there's something else we can do, as he writes in Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. Not only do we look to the cloud of witnesses, but we also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. Sometimes it's the things around us. It's our circumstances that make staying faithful to Jesus difficult. However, sometimes we make following Jesus more difficult than it needs to be by the choices we make and the things we do. A few years ago on Memorial Day weekend, I was at a college roommate's house. Our families still hang out a lot. And so we took our kids to their house, and we had a cookout, and we were laying around in the pool. And while I was laying on a pool floaty after lunch, he asked me, "Do you want to work out this afternoon?" And I said, from a pool floaty, laying there after lunch, "Not really. This is pretty good." But he convinced me, and he had a garage gym at his house. And so I said, all right. And so a couple hours later, we left our families in the pool, we went into his garage gym, and we were going to work out. And he was super into CrossFit, which I'm not built for CrossFit. I haven't done it much, but that was what he was into. And if you know anything about CrossFit and Memorial Day, you know that what he started to tell me, he started to describe this workout we were going to do called the Murph. Now, if you were here for my marathon story, I was more prepared for that workout than I was running a marathon, but I was not prepared for this workout. And so he starts to write on this board for us, here's what we're going to do. We're going to run a mile, and then we're going to do 100 pull-ups, and we're going to do 200 push-ups, and we're going to do 300 squats, and then to finish it all off, because that's not enough, we're going to run another mile. And so I stood there looking at the board, and I looked out the window at my wife and kids in the pool having fun. And while I was looking at the board, what I didn't know was he was behind me pulling out of this chest of torture devices he had 2 weighted vests. Because not only are you supposed to do this workout, you're supposed to do this workout while a weighted vest is on, and you have extra pounds that you're carrying around. I finished the workout. The vest did not stay on the whole time, so I finally got through it. But I say all this because I think this is a helpful description of how some Christians are experiencing the Christian life. The Christian life is hard. That when you look on the board at what Jesus is calling us to do, to love our enemies, to pray for those who persecute us, to live sacrificially, to put others before ourselves, the list goes on, and it's just not a natural way to live. And so it's already hard, but some of us are trying to live that hard life, and we're carrying around all this extra weight that makes it even more difficult. And that weight that we're carrying around is the sin that we've stopped fighting and that we've refused to let go of. Because what we see is this: if we're trying to follow Jesus, but we're not fighting sin, not that we'll be perfect, we won't be perfect this side of heaven, but we're not trying to take off the sin that clings closely in the language of Hebrews 2, we are making the Christian life infinitely harder. Because when we refuse to let go of sin, it's going to distract us from our ultimate goal and threaten to take us off course where we might not make it to the finish line. Or it'll keep us at a distance from Jesus because we'll feel shame over our sin, so we feel like we can't come to Jesus even though we can, and it will keep us separated from Him. Or, and this is the scariest thing, ongoing unrepentant habitual sin. We're all going to sin. We're not going to get rid of it. But ongoing, I know it's sin. I don't care that it's sin. I want to do this. Will harden our hearts toward God, we're told in the book of Hebrews. It will keep us from seeing the beauty of the gospel and all that Christ has done. And if there is this flame of love for God in our hearts, then our ongoing unrepentant sin is like these little splashes of water that splash on the flame and splash on the flame. And we'll see a little later in Hebrews 12, the fear is eventually it might extinguish the fire altogether. Again, maybe you're struggling in the Christian life right now because things are just hard around you and things have happened to you that were outside of your control, and that struggle's understandable. Maybe you're struggling in the Christian life right now because you're not pursuing obedience. You're not seeking Christ. You're not doing all you can to live the life He's calling you to live, and you're feeling the effects of that. You feel that extra weight on your shoulders, and you don't know that you can keep going like this. What's the weight you need to cast off today? Is there a sin you need to repent of that you haven't repented of, that you need to confess that you haven't confessed? Don't make the Christian life harder than it needs to be. Again, if the Spirit is prompting you in this way, listen to the Holy Spirit. If He's bringing something to mind, if He's stirring something in your heart, don't leave this room this morning without saying something, without taking it to God, without making a decision to take off this sin that is clinging close. But I know the fear that some have or the objection that some have, and it's this: I've got this sin that I can't get rid of, and I've tried and I've tried and I've done everything I can to stop. And I just can't seem to let go of it, and I don't know what to do. Back in Hebrews chapter 3, verses 12 and 13, this is one of the warnings we're given. Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God. But exhort one another every day, as long as it's called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. That's the fear, that sin might harden our hearts. So how do we fight the sin in our lives, especially the sin that just clings to us, that we can't seem to let go of? Again, maybe you know what that sin is in your life, and you've tried. You've made a long list of rules to keep that were supposed to change your behavior. Or you've asked others to hold you accountable, and they have, and they've asked about it, but nothing's really changed. Or you've read books on the topic, or talked with people who have had similar struggles, and you've put in the effort to try and stop sinning in this way, and you just can't seem to overcome it. What are we supposed to do when that's the situation we're in? What I've realized over the years, and I still don't do this perfectly, is that when most Christians attempt to overcome a sin, a strong impulse, and this was at least true for me, I think we often make a crucial mistake. And that mistake is this: if our focus is on only stopping doing the thing we don't want to do anymore, that's not a recipe for overcoming sin. When our sole focus is, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this, I don't want to think about this, that's not going to get us to a place where we can take off the sin that clings close to us, because ultimately our behavior springs from our desires. And often what we're doing is we're trying to change our behavior without trying to change our desires, because it's hard to know how to change your desires. What we recognize is this: we do what we want to do because we want to. We think it'll make us happy. It'll give us pleasure. It'll make us more comfortable. And so if we're going to change, we need a new and better desire than the sin that we want, that we can't seem to let go of. And until our desire for Jesus becomes stronger than our desire for a particular sin, we won't overcome those actions and those attitudes we can't seem to let go of. The author of Hebrews tells us in chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, we lay aside the sin that clings so closely, and then the very next thing he says is, by looking to Jesus. That the key to experiencing transformation in the Christian life is to look to Jesus and to keep looking at Him and to keep drawing close to Him. We do this by opening the Gospels and reading about who Jesus is and what He's done. We do this by gathering in worship and singing about Jesus and hearing about Jesus. We do this as we cultivate a personal relationship with Jesus through prayer and living our daily lives with Him. And when Jesus becomes the desire of our heart, the focus, the thing that we want more than anything else, we will cast aside the sin that clings to us. We might still stumble, we might still make a mistake, but when our love for Jesus becomes greater than our love for our sin, that's when change begins to happen. And if you struggle with not having that kind of desire for Jesus, I'd love to want Jesus in that way, but it's just not in me. I'd encourage you just begin to ask God for that desire. Ask God for the desire that you don't have, and I promise you this, if you begin praying to God, give me a desire to want Jesus more, to love Jesus more, God will answer that prayer. Sometimes when I'm thinking about this, I'll use the prayer of the 20th century author and pastor A.W. Tozer, who writes about this desire for God that he was trying to cultivate, and he would pray this: "Oh God, I've tasted your goodness, and it has both satisfied me and made me thirsty for more. I'm painfully conscious of my need for further grace. I'm ashamed of my lack of desire. Oh God, I want to want you." If you remember anything else from that prayer to pray, it might just be that simple breath prayer. God, I want to want you. I long to be filled with longing. I thirst to be made more thirsty still. Show me your glory so that I may know you. Begin in mercy a new work of love within me. Say to my soul, rise up, my love, my fair one, and come away. And then give me grace to rise and follow you up from this misty lowland where I have wandered so long. If you begin to pray to God to give you a desire for God, He will give you that desire. And so if we're going to run the Christian race well, if we're going to be faithful to the end, we need to have an accurate picture of the Christian life. We need to do all we can to throw off the sin that's weighing us down and stunting our progress in the Christian life. But there's one final thing we need to do, verse 3. Consider Him who endured from sinners, this is Jesus, such hostility against Himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by Him. For the Lord disciplines the one He loves and chastises every son He receives. It's for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you're left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you're illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them, but He disciplines us for our good, that we may share His holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. It's one thing to recognize that the Christian life is a marathon. It's another to realize the Christian life is a marathon and there are obstacles all over the course. And these obstacles might be opposition from others to what we believe about God. These obstacles might be the sin inside of us that's tempting us to disobey God. The obstacles might be questions or doubts or fears that we have about God, or loss and suffering that we experience in this life. All of these things will eventually tempt us to turn away from Jesus. And so knowing that, what do? First, as we said before, we remember struggle or opposition is to be expected in the Christian life. We shouldn't expect anything else. The well-known theologian J.I. Packer writes in his book, Knowing God, opposition is a fact. The Christian who is not conscious of being opposed had better watch himself, for he is in danger. Now, it's helpful to recognize there will be obstacles in the Christian life, but is that all that God has done for us? Has He made us aware of the obstacles and then just left us to ourselves to figure it out? Well, the first thing we're told in verse 3 is when those obstacles come, consider Him. Consider Jesus, who endured hostility against Himself. Jesus knows what it's like to suffer and struggle in this world. He knew that His faithfulness to God's will would lead Him to the cross, and He remained obedient anyway. And if Jesus could endure this extreme persecution and remain faithful to God, surely we can endure what we're facing, is the encouragement of Hebrews 12. Jesus is our example in this instance, and he's not asking us to do anything he wasn't willing to do himself. But in verse 7, we get another help here. And one of the reasons we have to endure difficult things in the Christian life, the author writes, it's for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. Skip down to verse 10. For they, earthly fathers, discipline us for a short time as it seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. Why should we endure suffering as Christians? Because Hebrews 12 is teaching us we serve a God who can take those obstacles, he can take those difficult circumstances, and he can use them for our good. He can use them as tools to help transform us and train us and discipline us and grow us. God can take what Satan or the world meant for evil and in his loving hand, use it for our good. We say this often, but we're reminded that in light of the sovereignty of God and the goodness of God, one of the hopes that we have as Christians is this: a Christian's suffering is never wasted in this life. I want to be clear what I'm saying here. This can be a difficult thing to believe, and it can sound trite. We're not saying when hard things come, just trust that it will all work out in the end. What Hebrews is telling us is that God is like a good father who wants his children to grow and mature into adulthood. And by his grace, one of the ways he's able to do that is by redeeming the suffering that we experience if we'll let him, and use those moments of hard things as an opportunity to help us grow into the person that he's created us to be. When life gets difficult, we're often tempted to respond in one of two ways. One, we want to push the pain away. We want to ignore it. We want to numb ourselves to it when we experience it. Or we're tempted to get angry about it. And we get angry with God, and we get angry with people around us, and we begin to push God away because, again, we think, if God is good and he's there and I'm going through this, something is wrong. I don't want a God like that. But the perspective that Hebrews 12 offers us is this: what if we began to see obstacles and difficulties in this life as opportunities for God to use to show us more of who he is and what he wants from us and how he wants us to live? What if we saw suffering as a furnace by which God is able to transform us into his image? And that doesn't mean suffering ceases to be painful. That doesn't mean we don't grieve when bad things happen. But it means that when we approach difficult circumstances, we approach them believing that God is good, that he's for us, and that he's going to use whatever we're experiencing for our ultimate good. The band can come up, and we're going to sing in just a second. What does this look like? The 15th century theologian Thomas à Kempis writes about this idea. And he says, the better you prepare yourself to meet suffering, the more wisely you will act, and the greater will be your merit. You will bear all the more easily if your heart and mind is diligently prepared. Don't say, I cannot endure such things from this person, or I will not tolerate these things. He has done me great injury and accused me of things I never considered. From another person I might bear it and regard it as something that must be endured. Such thoughts are foolish, he writes, for you ignore the merit of patience and him who rewards it, and only think of the person who has injured you and the wrong you endure. You are not truly patient, he writes, if you only endure what you think fit to endure, and only from those whom you like. A truly patient man does not consider by whom he is tried, whether by a superior, his equal, or an inferior, whether by a good and holy man, or by a perverse and wicked person. But however great or frequent the trial besets him, and by whatever agency it comes, he accepts it gladly as from the hand of God and counts it all as gain. What does this mean? This is an inconvenient truth, but how do we grow in the fruit of the Spirit? How do we get more loving and patient and kind and gentle? And the reality is, those things only grow in us as we go through experiences where we're tempted to not be loving and kind and gentle and patient and all the things that God is calling us to be. Often it requires us to be in situations where, again, we're tempted to not be those things. It requires us to have kids and spouses and coworkers and friends and family members and even strangers in our lives who could potentially bring out the worst in us, because it's in those moments God can do His greatest work in us. Sometimes we're tempted to think, if work was less crazy and my kids were less crazy and I could just get out of these chaotic circumstances I'm in, then I could focus on my relationship with God and what He wants to do in my life. And the reality is, no, that's where God is going to do the work. When your kids are bouncing off the walls, when you are struggling with relationships, when you have an overbearing boss, that's where spiritual transformation happens, as we take those opportunities to press into God and to ask Him to do a work in us we cannot do ourselves. And in that, our difficult circumstances become the path to spiritual growth. Maybe this will make more sense with the helpful illustration of donuts. Stick with me. This is the last thing. Article a few years ago writes, Krispy Kreme Donuts is one of the fastest, I don't know if this is still true, at one point was one of the fastest growing franchises in America. In addition to their unique taste, a key to Krispy Kreme's phenomenal success is its strategic blueprint for individual shops. Customers can watch through a wall of glass while donuts are created along an assembly line conveyor system. If you've ever been, you know this is hypnotizing almost. That when I would go see my grandparents growing up, we would always go to Krispy Kreme every time we were at Grandma and Grandpa's, and we would watch these donuts get made. They write about the process. First, the little balls of dough are shot through with a piercing blast of air to create a hole. Then the flat donuts are forced to spend time in the proof box, where they ride a vertical elevator up and down in an atmosphere of heat and humidity, much like the one we're in right now. I know, we're working on it. This is what allows the flat dough to rise. Then the soon-to-be delicacies are dropped into hot oil in order to be cooked thoroughly. As the circular survivors of such an intense ordeal make their way toward the end of the line, they pass through a cascading waterfall of icing. It's almost like poetry, what this guy's writing. He closes, just as these poor donuts' trials produce a product of great delight to the customer. It is the trials God allows in our lives that bring about what most delights us in Him. And when we begin to see our difficulties in that way, it changes our approach. Again, nothing wrong to feel pain over suffering that we experience, but we see God's hand in the midst of it, bringing out something good we couldn't bring out on our own. And so as we close this morning, and as we think about remaining faithful to Jesus to the end, because the reality is we probably all have family members and friends who were once faithful to Jesus, and they've walked away, and they're not with us on Sunday mornings anymore, and they've decided to go their own path. How can we ensure we will remain faithful to the end, that we will cross the finish line of this life faithful to Jesus? We have clear expectations of what the Christian life actually is and what God has actually promised us. We fight the sin that's in our lives that we struggle to overcome so it doesn't weigh us down and distract us. And when hard times do come, we have the hope that God can do something in the midst of those things, and we don't use them as opportunities to walk away from Him because we fear He's abandoned us. I'll pray, and then we'll sing.